So let's dive a little deeper into the subject of the call that you really wanted to talk about, which was perception versus how did you say it?
Yeah, perception versus perspective. Exactly right.
Which I see it as in non-duality is turning on the observer and learning to use the observer. So let's talk about it from your perspective.
Yeah. So that was the perfect segue. Let's talk about it from your perspective. When you just started that sentence just a second ago, Brian, you said, when I hear you say those words, it makes me think of the observer. And was it non-duality? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So non-duality. Collapsing duality allows you to go free of outcome.
The place where your brain went was your perception. Yeah. It was what's important to you, what you value, what you care about, what you're interested in. That is the natural human response. That is how every human being is wired. It goes back to self-preservation, fight or flight, us living as cavemen, having to protect our own life first, right? Perception is totally natural. It's what's wired into all of us. It's why when someone says something that's interesting to you, you respond by talking about all the interesting things you know about or you learned about with regard to that subject. It's what kills the first contact with a female, because she's going to say something and then you're going to start rattling off about yourself. And the last thing anybody wants to hear about is you. The one subject no one ever gets tired of hearing someone else talk about is themselves, right? If you talk about me, I'm going to let you talk all day long, Brian. I'm going to love everything you have to say. But if you sit there and talk about yourself, in about 3.5 minutes, I'm going to be wondering if someone texted me, if there's something else I need to be doing, what's on my grocery list, right? So perspective is what happens when you intentionally think about what the other person's experience is. The reason that it's so valuable to operators is because we already know 99.9% of people out there are untrained in what we're talking about right now. The vast majority of people are operating according to their animalistic wiring. They're thinking through their own two eyes, their own perspective. That's all that matters to their own perception. That's all that matters to them. When you enter a situation thinking about perspective, what does my target think? What do the two people at the 2 exit doors think? What do the 5 people sitting in the back row think is happening in this conversation? You gain this informational edge, this dominant position over everything else in the room, because you are the only person considering multiple data points from all points of view to have an overarching perspective of the situation. I'm going to keep talking if you just give me another second.
Yeah, go for it. Keep going.
I just came off of a weekend teaching people escape and evasion in an urban setting, and it was badass, right? One of the things that we did is we taught them physical defense, something called defensive tactics, how to basically connect mind to body and use that to defend yourself in an anti-kidnapping situation or a kidnapping situation. And one of the most powerful elements that always comes up when I teach people this is that if you used Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if you're one of those people who learned Krav Maga or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to defend yourself, if you actually get into a scuffle on the street and some attacker tries to attack you, and then you beat the shit out of that attacker, right? You're throat punching, you're face punching, you take them to the ground, you've got them in arm bar, and then a police officer shows up. Who does the police officer think is the threat? You, because you're the one kicking the other guy's ass, right? You have completely lost perspective because in your perception, you're thinking I'm under attack. Meanwhile, everybody else around you is thinking the poor bastard that you're beating up is the innocent victim. And that's how cops end up pointing guns at the wrong people, right? That element, the importance of that point of view is immensely powerful when it comes to running any kind of operation or having any kind of end goal where you want a specific outcome. Because you need to control the entire situation. You can control the entire environment if you keep in mind the perspective of others, because everyone else is just thinking about their own point of view, their own perception, their own interests and values.
So tell me if I got this right. You're talking about basically, well, in natural law, I call it the law of relativity or the relative nature, getting a big relative perspective. And I did say the observer, the context versus content. Are these analogies correct?
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay, awesome. And so you spend a lot of time coming in. When you come into any situation, you start with context before you start with content, is what you're saying.
Yeah, you start with what is, if you're talking about context, meaning what am I walking into? Where is this person's heart, mind, and goals right now? And where do I fit into that long term? That's exactly right.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Do you ever share, and maybe you do this intentionally or maybe you do it unintentionally, but you're saying, you really want to get them talking, but sometimes to get somebody talking, to get them sharing, it requires a bit of you sharing, because you have to share something vulnerable, which then makes them feel safe to open up to you. Did you ever make this as part of the whole picture?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have a funny rule of thumb. So a lot of times what happens with folks who come to Everyday Spy training is they'll come in and they'll be introverted when they come in. And they'll have struggled with either social environments or maybe work conflict, relationship conflict, peer conflict, whatever it might be. And I teach them this concept about perspective and perception. I teach them how important it is to know how to use a question to your own operational advantage. And then they say the same thing that you were saying earlier, right? Like, how do I know when I'm asking a question versus when I'm giving an interrogation? Mm. And the trick that we were always taught, because if analysis paralysis sets in, you got to have a way of breaking it. The trick that we were taught was 2 questions and 1 confirmation, 2 questions and 1 acknowledgement, basically, right? So, Brian, I'll ask you 2 questions about you. And then whatever you say in response to the second question, I will then make a connection where I acknowledge what you said and make it relevant to me. So when I talk about myself, I'm talking about myself through something that you've told me about you. So every time I talk about me, I'm building a connection because I'm basing my commentary off of you. You tell me that you like old movies. I'll tell you I like old movies that are musicals. Maybe you don't like musicals. Doesn't really matter. You like old movies, and now you're looking at me and you think Andy likes old movies too. He's a cool guy, right?
Yeah.
If I were to just roll in and be like, hey, I really love 1950s era musicals, then there's no context for you. Your guy, that's kind of weird, buddy. Like, where have you been for the last 50 years? Right? So it's a completely different way of leveraging questions or leveraging that connection to your own advantage.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And I'll relate it back to something. The first time I learned the art of rapport, which was a workshop I took many years ago, they would call it like almost like a hot potato. You're sharing a little, then asking a question, sharing a little. But I like what you just did there, because what you did there was a little different. You said ask 2 questions and then share a little. And it keeps the focus a little on the other person. And that's the intent, I'm guessing.
That's exactly right, man. Because remember, the thing that no one ever gets tired of hearing you talk about is them. So keep asking them questions. Never let it get to that interview state. It's amazing. You'll spend hours doing 2 and 1, 2 and 1, 2 and 1. And instead of the person ever stopping to say, oh, I'm talking too much about myself, let's ask about you, it'll never happen. They'll just stay in this happy world, right? In, like you were saying, a flow state. They'll just stay very comfortably. And every time they talk, they're investing more and more into you and more into the relationship that you're building. It works like a dream with business clients. It works like a dream during interviews when you're looking at hiring somebody or firing somebody. It's amazing how much you can disarm somebody just by keeping 66% of the attention on them, 33% of the attention on you. If you like this short clip, make sure you click here to see the next clip or here to see the full podcast episode.